Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. You can sign up for Texas+Water by visiting texas+water.org, and you can sign up for the Texas+Water Journal at texas.waterjournal.org. Both publications are free. My guest today is Joel Scata. Joel is an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. He works to develop federal and state policy solutions to address the impacts of climate change. In particular, he focuses on addressing sea level rise and extreme weather events and their connection to flooding disasters. Joel, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Hi, Todd. Thank you for having me on. I look forward to the podcast.
Great. So let's start out with your background in water. How did you first become involved with water?
Primarily by luck. So the job with NRDC is my first position since law school, focusing on environmental issues. And before I was at law school, I was actually working on the opposite end. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa working on drought-related issues, mostly looking at how to prevent erosion and desertification from excessive heat and drought. And so working on water was a bit of a change, but a great one. I really enjoy what I'm doing on it. And I kind of fell into it by being hired by the Water and Climate team at NRDC.
Joel, tell us about the focus of your work for NRDC.
Sure. So I work on the Water and Climate team as one of their attorneys. And the Water and Climate team's mission is primarily to assess how both federal and state policy can be developed or amended to make sure that communities are better prepared for the impacts of climate change.
And so as part of that, I guess you recently authored an article for the American Bar Association's Natural Resources and Environment publication. And the title of that article was "A Rising Tide Lifts All Damage Costs, the Need for a Federal Flood Protection Standard." So why don't you tell us about that article?
I'd be happy to. So I wrote an article for the American Bar Association that really gets at the issue of how the way current federally funded infrastructure projects are being built is not taking into account the changing climate. So a lot of the ways that we design and plan our infrastructure is based on the past. We look at past climatic conditions as a judge for the future. But climate change is really sort of like a wrench thrown into the gears of that approach, because it's changing how past climate history has been. And so we really need to think about, when we build infrastructure projects, we're building them with a bigger margin of safety. And so the article addresses the change in climate conditions, for example, like how sea level rise is increasing, there's going to be bigger rain events, which impact floodplains, and how the way we currently build infrastructure is inadequate. And that's why helping to either elevate that infrastructure above current flood levels, often the 1% annual chance flood level is the basic standard, or just flood-proofing them, it would be very beneficial for not only protecting that property, but also just protecting the assets on which communities rely.
So one of the things I liked about your article is that you have a lot of research results summarized. Mm-hmm. And you fit into your argument well, I think. I want to read something that was in your article. A federal emergency management agency sponsored study conducted by AECOM, a multinational engineering firm, estimates that riverine environments may experience on average a 45% expansion of the typical 100-year floodplain by 2100. And the paragraph goes on to say, this enlargement of the floodplain is largely attributed to changing precipitation patterns. So that really strikes out too. But it struck me because it's a massive expansion of the area. Have to be now if you 100-year floodplain, which we also called the 1% floodplain. You got a 1% chance every year that you're going to be flooded. And so if that expands by 45%, that's just a massive increase in the area that is subject to flooding and flood damage.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the changing precipitation patterns, mostly just heavier rainstorms, coupled with changing development patterns, just paving over more land to build homes and malls and stuff, combined really do change the floodplains. And so when you have an expansion like that, on an average of 45% expansion by the end of the century, we're talking about some major changes that will be impacting infrastructure that's built today, if it's not planned for. The 1% annual chance floodplain, or the 100-year floodplain, is often the basic measurement used by FEMA to delineate their floodplain. And a lot of times people look at the floodplain map and say, I'm either in or I'm out. And if I'm out, I'm good. But that's not accurate. It's not a binary choice like that, especially with climate change. That floodplain is going to be growing. And if we're not building infrastructure with, that's supposed to last maybe 40, 50 years with that lifespan in mind about how the climate's going to change around it, it's kind of setting it up for failure.
Now, this article concludes essentially with you saying that we need a new federal flood protection standard that requires a higher margin of safety for siting and design for federally funded infrastructure projects to better protect those projects and the communities and residents that rely on that infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So, I understand that, in part, the federal regulations on floodplains have been altered recently. And so in response, you're saying that, look, we need this new federal flood standard. And so talk to us a little bit about that. What's been repealed recently that might have covered this area, and how is what you're proposing, different, or is it just the same as the recent rollback in regulations?
Sure. So in 2015, the Obama administration issued Executive Order 13690, and that created what they call the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which applied to all federally funded infrastructure projects. So basically, if you were a federal agency and you wanted to either build a office building yourself or provide a grant to someone else, like a state, to build perhaps a hospital, you would have had to abide by that standard. And what that standard required was a higher margin of safety to what we're accustomed to for flooding. So right now, most structures are just built to the height of the 100-year flood, or the 1% annual chance flood. That federal flood risk management standard required that they be elevated according to three different approaches. One would be 2 feet for non-critical buildings, like your typical office building, 3 feet for critical infrastructure like hospitals, police stations, fire stations, or in which was encouraged in coastal areas, an assessment of the lifespan of the project and how the climate and flood conditions would change around it, in particularly sea level rise, and then try to build above probably the medium projection to make sure those structures were safe. That got underway in 2015. Agencies started developing rules to implement it. And then in 2017, 10 days before Hurricane Harvey struck, the Trump administration revoked it. And the standards all reverted back to only build infrastructure to the 100-year flood level, or the 1% annual chance flood level. And that's going to have some big repercussions in terms of how we build new federally funded infrastructure and even rebuild certain infrastructure. So under some of the big hurricanes that have hit recently, a lot of infrastructure was damaged. Public infrastructure was damaged. And according to the law, if it was damaged by more than 50% of its value, it has to be rebuilt. And the federal flood risk management standard had required it to be rebuilt with that higher protection in mind. Now that it's been revoked, it's likely going to be rebuilt to this current standard, which kind of just sets it up for failure because we know it's already it's not working.
So this standard would, obviously reduce damage to these facilities that are built in the 1% floodplain and save the federal government a lot of money and probably everybody else, and also reduce the potential for the loss of life within that same area.
That's correct. Yeah. So federal agencies started implementing a new flood protection standard, which I advocate for in the article. It would better protect those assets. And as you mentioned, that has a lot of co-benefits, primarily, making sure that the federal government is not constantly paying to rebuild something over and over again. And the federal government gets its money from taxpayers. So it's just prudent use of taxpayer dollars. Another big co-benefit is, reduced interruptions. So a lot of times after a major flood, especially in urban areas, you see water infrastructure going offline. If a water treatment plant gets flooded and it wasn't protected well, that has a big issue for, just health and safety, as well as business interruption if people can't use water to operate their businesses. And so by having a higher flood protection standard for these federally funded assets, it really does ensure that we're better protecting them. So not only we're just being more prudent with our dollars, but also planning for a future that's going to be a little more tenuous in terms of flooding than what we're accustomed to.
Now, Austin had some experience with a situation like that with a water treatment plant that was flooded a year or so ago. So I'm familiar with that a little bit here. So let me just ask you a different question. Flooding. In the past we've approached flood, mitigate by or addressed it by building a dam or building less structure to that. But now we have a range of non-structural solutions as well. Restoring wetlands, using conservation easements to protect floodplains, other things like that. Can you talk a little bit about kind of those two approaches to mitigating flood risk?
Sure. So for a future of flood mitigation, the question is kind of like, should we be focusing more on the structural solutions like we have done in the past, your big levees, dams, seawalls, or your non-structural solutions, restoring wetlands, building living shorelines? And my answer to that is yes, we should be focusing more so on the non-structural approaches. However, my overly, to the point answer is based on a number of factors. The first one is that large-scale structural solutions like levees and seawalls are fixed in place, which means that those projects commit communities to current predictions of heavy rainstorms and current sea levels, and they cannot be easily adjusted if weather patterns, land use, or other risk factors change. And we know those risk factors are changing. As we discussed earlier, that study that came out from AECOM projects that on average, our floodplains are going to increase by 45% in riverine communities, and even more so possibly for coastal communities. And because of that, if we're only building structural solutions that don't take into account that future, that are really just meant to protect today, they're not going to do what they're intended to do, and that is to protect communities. Whereas your non-structural approaches, they allow for a bit of flexibility. And that's because with a living shoreline, it can adjust if it has room to do so as tides go further inland due to sea level rise. Or if you restore a floodplain, you have an ability for that flood water to kind of move into the area that's naturally meant to move into, and not get pushed down the line. And so that's one big reason. Another one is just non-structural solutions have more co-benefits than a big levee. A big levee is meant to do one thing, and that's just to block floodwaters from coming into a community. But with non-structural solutions like living shorelines or like floodplain restoration, you get more than just flood protection. You also get co-benefits like water filtration in case of preserving wetlands, which helps reduce pollutants. You get ecosystem benefits. And so like in coastal areas, not building a massive levee or a seawall, but instead doing a living shoreline, you can incorporate things like oyster reefs, which help the fishery industry. And lastly, it kind of prevents what we often refer to as levee wars. So especially where I'm from in Illinois, up and down the Mississippi River, in states like Missouri, up into Iowa, and then back down, there are a lot of levees. Communities build them because the river can flood pretty frequently and highly. But the problem with that is that when you build a levee and you make it bigger than it was before, it just pushes the water further down the river. So while your community is protected, the next community down is not. So what does that mean? They have to build a levee higher. And then on down the line until you're looking at this huge levee war where communities are trying to outbuild each other just to stay safe. And you don't have that problem with natural solutions.
So, and part of all this, I think is our, kind of assessment of risk when we are, making investments in real estate and other kinds of investments. And so, I read something recently I want to ask you about. An analysis by the nonpartisan National Bureau of Economic Research showed that when prospective real estate buyers knew their property was at an increased risk for flooding, they were less willing to pay as much for that property than they would be for a property where the flood risk was lower, which makes sense, right? And so they found in this research that the losses from extreme weather events were rising, and as sea level rises and the climate warms, and that the losses are mostly related to the concentration of people and investments in areas that are the most vulnerable to flooding. And so, this same study kind of concluded markets really aren't favoring that are related to flooding. And I'm just curious, do you think that conclusion is right, that if people knew more about the risks associated with floodplains due to climate change or anything else, that they'd be less willing to invest in those areas?
I agree with the findings of that study. And I think, a significant barrier to encouraging climate smart development is just access to information about flood risk. So the more informed people are, the better able they are to make smart decisions about how much risk they're willing to take on. But if they don't have access to that information, it's really hard to kind of internalize that, both in the market or just in their own actions. And when it comes to flood risk, there is a big information gap. You see it in the pricing of flood insurance. You see it in the inadequacy of flood risk disclosure laws across the country. And you even really see it in the flood risk data that is made available by FEMA. When you think about the flood risk disclosure laws, the majority of laws in this country are fairly inadequate when it comes to what buyers are told about flood risk. NRDC did a study about 2 years ago now that ranked states based on the adequacy of their disclosure law when it comes to flooding. And we found about 2/3 of the states had a grade of D or lower. They either had no statutory or regulatory requirement that a seller disclosed to a buyer the flood history. So like in Missouri, there's no statutory or regulatory requirement that a seller tell a buyer if the house is flooded before. They're required to tell the buyer if the house is a meth lab, but not whether it's ever flooded. And so in a state like Missouri, which is very flood prone, you think, they should be telling people about their flood risk. Other states, they only really have to tell the buyer if they're in a floodplain. And most of the time that's not really revealed until the actual closing. And so that has a huge problem with buyers getting into these homes that they think are safe, but they're not. And so having more disclosure when it comes to flooding would be prudent. And Texas actually, I believe in the last year, has passed one of the best laws in the nation when it comes to disclosure on flooding. They require a slew of detail that must be disclosed to buyers about past flood histories, insurance requirements for the property, how much that insurance costs, and other aspects that really are beneficial to helping make an informed decision.
Yeah, we've had one big flood after the other here in Texas, and the legislature has definitely responded to that. And, the Texas Water Journal has a recent article about that I encourage everybody to go take a look at. So you mentioned the flood insurance program, or people also call it the NFIP. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that and whether you think it's been effective in reducing flood losses in the United States. I mean, I think the story that people hear regularly is about people, who've got a house in the floodplain, and 1% floodplain maybe, and it's destroyed by a flood, and then they get money to rebuild it. Mm-hmm. And that happens over and over again. So tell us a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program and whether you think it's effective or not.
Sure. So the National Flood Insurance Program, for better or worse, is the predominant influence on flooding, I guess you say floodplain development in this country. So it's not just an insurance program. There's really like three legs to the stool that makes up the NFIP. Insurance is one aspect, but the program also requires that if a community wants to make insurance available to its residents, then that community has to adopt minimum building and land use regulations or ordinances to protect against flooding. And it also produces floodplain maps. So floodplain maps are often used to help determine the insurance rates, but they're also used extensively by communities to assess their risk. One of the benefits of the flood program is that the minimum criteria. So at least there is some level of protection that has to be accounted for when developing in a floodplain. The most impactful is that communities that adopt the NFIP have to build their homes to the height of the 1% annual chance flood. And when you look at the insurance payouts of the program, you notice that a lot of the homes that are insured are those that were built before the flood program began, and they flood frequently. NRDC, through a FOIA request, actually got a list of the most repeatedly flooded properties in the United States, and they made up less than 1% of all the NFIP policies, but accounted for well over almost 10% of the claims. So they are a big drain on the program. But overall, the program, as I said, provides insurance and provides some basic criteria to which homes and other buildings need to be built. And they also provide floodplain maps. Floodplain maps are important because of the development aspect, but there are a lot of concerns about them being backward looking. So they are based on the historical record of flooding. But as we've discussed, climate change is altering how floods happen, and the maps don't really reflect that. So you might look at a map and say, I'm just outside the 100-year floodplain. My house is going to be safe. But the floodplain is growing. And I think one of the best things that FEMA could do would be to, at least as an advisory layer on the map, is include future conditions about hydrology changes.
Well, let me ask you about that. The FEMA flood maps. I was looking at some research that was published a couple of years ago in Environmental Research Letters, an article, estimates of future flood risk in the coterminous United States. And it essentially says that there are 41 million U.S. residents that live along the nation's rivers that are at risk of flooding, and that's actually 2.5 to over, it says 2.6 to 3.1 times higher than the amount of risk that FEMA, I guess, has determined based on their maps. And so, I mean, do you think it's reasonable that the floodplain maps underestimated by that much, 2.5 to over 3 times?
Absolutely. So one thing that one of the big shortcomings of the floodplain mapping program is that it only maps about 1/3 of the country. So that means 2/3 of the country don't have any floodplain maps, which means there's a lot of information that's missing. Now, granted, the majority of the people, or the majority of the country's population are in mapped areas, but that means new areas that are developing are not mapped. And so those people are at risk of flooding and don't know about it. And as far as the mapped areas, the study was able to do a much more granular analysis of the floodplains. So they looked at streams and rivers that are considered too small to appear on a floodplain map from FEMA. And so there's a lot of the little tributaries and, backyard gullies with water in them that don't get mapped, but do flood and put people at risk. And so that's what the study really highlights, is that the mapping program is missing a lot. I think you're going to start to see some big changes. So with new technology, it's easier to map. FEMA doesn't use LiDAR to do mapping, but that's something that's pretty common practice now. And I think you'll start to see that in the future with just the need to be better at it. And FEMA is looking at ways to improve their mapping.
So let me kind of shift a little bit to wetlands, because a lot of areas in the floodplains are wetlands, or wetlands are commonly found in floodplains. And the regulations that protect wetlands, in part through the Clean Water Act, have been altered recently. And the waters of the United States, under the Clean Water Act, or also known as WOTUS, I guess is the acronym, has reduced the area that has been given protection from these wetlands being filled in or other impacts. And so I'm interested in what you think about the protection of wetlands and relationship to flooding, or whether there is a relationship.
Yeah, so the Clean Water Act has really driven improvements in our nation's waterways since the early 70s. And for instance, over the past several decades, bacteria and sediment decreased, and dissolved oxygen levels increased, which makes for just healthier water systems. They're more fishable. A big part of that is because raw sewage now is required to get treated before it's dumped in our rivers. Also, the Clean Water Act prevents industry from dumping about 700 billion pounds of toxic pollutants into the nation's waterways every year. And the rate of wetlands loss, which is probably the most important in terms of flooding, has decreased substantially compared to the pre Clean Water Act era. And, when people think of wetlands, they're not just these annoying malaria plague swamps that for history were often seen as a nuisance. Wetlands are really crucial to a healthy ecosystem, not only in terms of just reducing pollution, but providing a way for floodwaters to kind of attenuate, so they're not building up and damaging infrastructure. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has finalized a new rule that really guts the Clean Water Act. The dirty water rule, as we tend to call it, kind of declares that numerous water bodies that for a long time have been protected by the law, even before the rule proposed by the Obama administration that the Trump administration rolled back, are no longer to be protected. So that means with this rollback, the Trump administration has made it easier for these waterways to not only be polluted, but also for wetlands that really are crucial to help reducing flooded to be destroyed. And so because wetlands serve as natural flood barriers, you could see an increase in flooding by rolling back some of the core protections that the Clean Water Act itself provided, not even talking about the extension that the Obama administration had proposed to it. And so I think the dirty water rule really will have a negative impact on how we address flood risk in this country.
So, from my personal experience, used to go to Houston quite a bit, in the Houston area when I was young, and some areas I used to visit, which were wetlands and out country, that those were filled in, and many of them, and became housing developments, and so in similar way that a kind of this, you're filling in the wetlands, and so the water, which may have been stored by the wetland during a flood, now ends up going downstream and flooding out somebody else.
Right.
And so, that's one of the things that's really occurred to me. We're worried about flooding, and we're trying to figure out ways to reduce flood risks, but at the same time, we're making it easier for people to develop areas that flood, and by developing them, increase the risk of flooding to somebody else downstream, which just does not seem logical.
No, it's not. It's definitely counterintuitive in terms of talking on one hand about the need to better mitigate and protect buildings and infrastructure from flooding, and on the other, going ahead and paving our natural protection against flooding. I think in the Houston area, because so much of the region had been developed and paved over, and these natural features that help absorb water and rain is what contributed to a lot of the flooding you've seen in that area in the last 3 or 4 years. And then it's only going to get worse as bigger rainstorms become more common with climate change. And so we really need to be thinking about the broader kind of concept about how we develop. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't develop. It just means we should develop smart.
Joel, I really enjoyed our discussion today. Can you tell our listeners how they can find out more about flood issues?
Sure. So there's a couple of good places to go. If you go to the NRDC website, www.nrdc.org, and kind of look at their climate adaptation pages, there's a lot of information there about the various programs that we're advocating for to help with flooding. So there's information about the flood protection standard. There's information about our proposed reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as some information about just managed retreat. So there's certain areas that are going to be underwater no matter how high we build those buildings. So it's actually more cost effective to buy those homeowners out voluntarily and help them move somewhere safer and allow that to become natural floodplain again. It's a big issue for us, just because we realize that some people, they truly don't want to stay in their homes because they flood so much. And so they need to be given an out. And so there's that area to look at. I'd also recommend checking out this new study by the National Institute of Building Sciences called Mitigation Saves 2019. It's about 700 pages long, but there's a lot of executive summaries to it that talks about the different mitigation approaches you can use for flooding. And it talks about not only building to code, the most recent code, which is the 2018 I-codes, but also exceeding code. They found that in some areas, even if you built 5 feet above the height of the 1% annual chance floodplain, you're still going to have a really good benefit cost ratio. And so it's really useful for, I think, developers and community planners to take a look at that study and learn about how they can mitigate their flood risks.
Great. Joel, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Todd. I really had fun. It was a good time.
This has been Talk+Water. My guest today was Joel Scata, an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. My name is Todd Votteler, the host of Talk+Water. Let's talk water again soon.